Congratulations! You've just accepted the worst job in Europe. The good news? You've got steady work. The bad news? That work is wandering through the gates of a dying city with nothing but a bird mask, a stick, and a contract that might as well be your death sentence. They call you a plague doctor, and the name sounds noble, maybe even heroic. But step through the city wall, and it becomes very clear, very fast, that there's nothing noble about this. The air hits you first. It's thick, oily, cloying like rotten eggs mixed with open wounds and burnt hair. Somewhere ahead, a bell is ringing. Not for mass, for death. Another body. Another home sealed shut. Another name crossed out in the parish log. You adjust your mask. It's heavy, suffocating, and reeks of the vinegar-soaked herbs stuffed inside the beak. Supposedly, they'll protect you from the plague, but you can already feel the sweat pooling in your boots. Your robe is stiff waxed leather. Your gloves are cracked, and your stick, a thin wooden rod, is your only defense. Not against the disease, against the people. And let's be clear, they hate you. Some think you bring the plague. Some think you're hiding the cure. All of them know you're the one who comes knocking when it's already too late. Welcome to the job. They say you volunteered. But that's not quite right. You were offered the position after real doctors fled, priests started dying, and the mayor couldn't convince even the undertaker to come back. You weren't chosen because of skill. You were chosen because you were desperate. You needed the money, or you were already disgraced, or maybe you just didn't believe it was real. But now you're here, and it's very real. The first house is quiet, too quiet. You don't knock, there's no point. You simply push the door open with your stick and step inside. The family is already gone. Not gone to the next town, gone. Mother in the bed, arms crossed. Father slumped in a chair, black spots like spilled ink blooming across his neck. 2 children under a sheet. The smallest still clutches a doll. You write it all down. Cause of death? Plague. Symptoms? Buboes? Fever? Vomiting? Death? Treatment administered? None. You weren't called to save them. You were called to record them. Out comes the chalk. You draw a crude mark on the door. Another house documented. Another corpse for the tally. You move on. Your job isn't to cure. It's to witness, to count, to make it look like someone is in control. You're a symbol of order, of effort, of desperate hope. And also a warning. When the beak arrives, hope is gone. The people you meet fall into 2 categories, those who hide from you and those who run at you screaming. The latter are the dangerous ones. Mothers who've lost their children. Men who think the bird mask is a joke. Priests who've started speaking in tongues. You keep walking. You do not run. Because if you do, they chase you. You take your notes. You record deaths. You sometimes attempt treatments. Boil lancing, bloodletting, enemas made from garlic and butter. None of it works. But it makes people feel like you're doing something. Occasionally, someone survives. No one knows why. But they all think it's your doing. Suddenly, you're a miracle worker until the next patient dies. Then you're the devil again. This mask? It doesn't protect you. Not really. It just hides you. Hides your fear. Hides your identity. Hides the stink of rot and sweat and failure. You can barely breathe inside it. And the leather robe traps heat like a furnace. On summer days, you cook inside it. In winter, it stiffens like old jerky. Either way, it becomes your second skin, and not in a good way. You can't take it off. Not because of germs, because of them, the people. They need the mask. They expect it. It's the only thing that separates you from the dying and the dead. You used to be someone, a scholar, a barber, a student. Now you're just the beak, a walking omen. And if you die, they'll burn your robe, maybe bury your mask, but they'll replace you. Because there's always someone more desperate. Being a plague doctor is not about healing. It's about surviving long enough to make it to payday, if there is one. And to understand just how twisted this costume really was and why it made things worse, not better, we need to look deeper inside the beak. Let's get something straight. The beak, the iconic, creepy, crow-faced thing that made plague doctors look like goth pelicans, wasn't designed for intimidation. That part was just a bonus. It was meant to protect you. But instead, it became a symbol of how little anyone understood disease, and how far people would go to fake control in a world unraveling. Let's unpack what went into the beak. Literally. First off, the beak was usually stuffed with a combination of dried flowers, herbs, and spices. Things like lavender, rose petals, mint, cloves, and camphor. Sometimes even myrrh, which was apparently good enough for baby Jesus. So why not throw it in there too? The goal? To ward off the bad air. You see, they didn't believe in germs. Germ theory wouldn't arrive until centuries later. Instead, medieval medicine believed in miasma, the idea that disease came from putrid, corrupted air. Smells, they thought, were the sickness. And so, the beak was basically a medieval air freshener, a desperate attempt to sniff flowers instead of filth while walking through the valley of death. But it didn't work. It couldn't. Because the plague wasn't in the air, it was in the fleas. The rats, the bodies, the breath, and the beak? It just recycled your own panic, soaked in sweat and scented with failure. Some beaks were nearly half a foot long. Why so long? To keep the bad air as far away from the nose as possible. It made logical sense if you believed in 14th century science. But in practice, it meant you couldn't turn your head easily. You had tunnel vision. You'd bump into furniture. And you couldn't see your feet. Not ideal when those same streets were littered with rats, rotting bodies, and sewage. Inside the beak were not just herbs, but also things like vinegar-soaked sponges, garlic cloves, and in one recorded case, crushed emeralds. Yes, someone thought sniffing ground-up gemstones would help. It didn't, but it made them feel rich while dying. Sometimes, doctors added camphor or mercury. Problem: mercury is poisonous. So you weren't just suffocating, you were lightly seasoning your lungs with neurotoxins. Then came the eye holes. Glass lenses, stylish but foggy. They distorted vision, especially when you were sweating bullets, which you always were. Combine that with the beak, and you've now got the peripheral vision of a medieval horse wearing blinders. And just as much awareness of what was actually killing people. But the beak wasn't the only part that made the mask a death trap. The whole headgear was designed to be airtight to keep the foul air out, which meant no ventilation. You weren't just hot, you were cooking. Plague doctors often suffered heat stroke, exhaustion, or dizziness while trying to lance someone else's buboes. Fun times. And here's the kicker. People were so terrified of the beak mask that it actually backfired. Instead of comforting the sick, plague doctors often triggered full-blown panic attacks. Children screamed. Parents wept. In some towns, people locked their doors when they saw the beak coming, not to avoid disease, but to avoid you. In Florence, some records say patients refused to be treated by plague doctors because they looked like devils. And can you blame them? Imagine your final moment on Earth being face to face with a giant crow wearing gloves and holding a cane. Worse still, the beak wasn't even standardized. Some doctors made their own. Others got hand-me-downs. In desperate villages, you could be handed a leather sack with a bird's beak stitched on the front and told, "Here, you're the doctor now." Even the beak's invention isn't as old as most people think. It didn't come around during the Black Death of the 1340s. It showed up centuries later, in the 1600s, mostly in France and Italy. So when you picture the iconic plague doctor during the first wave of Black Death, he wasn't wearing the mask. he was probably just in a robe, breathing directly on everyone, and wondering why he felt dizzy. Over time, the beak became theater. In Venice, it turned into part of the carnival costume. People wore it as satire, a joke about death, a mockery of the doctors who couldn't save them, a literal mask of failure. Today, it's become Halloween fodder, a meme, a costume. But back then, it was the face of fear. A failed solution worn by desperate men walking through cities that smelled like death, praying they didn't touch the wrong doorknob. And the suit? Oh, the suit is somehow worse than the beak. If the beak was a nightmare for your nose, the suit was a prison for your body. Let's talk about the infamous plague doctor uniform, not the beak. We've covered that horror show. The rest of it, the gloves, the boots, the long black robe that made you look like the Grim Reaper's less fashionable cousin. It was meant to protect you, but really, it turned you into a slow-cooked corpse in training. The suit was typically made of thick, waxed leather, sometimes layered over canvas or wool. Why waxed? To seal out the disease again, because they thought sickness floated through the air like a ghost. So they wanted the outfit to be airtight. Imagine stepping outside on a summer day wearing a waxed leather raincoat, long gloves, tall boots, and a hood. Now imagine doing that while walking through piles of rotting corpses. It wasn't just hot, it was unbearable. Some suits had multiple layers, tied tight with strings or belts. A full set included gloves, a hat or hood, boots, and the robe, everything covered. You were swaddled like a sweaty burrito of bad decisions. The goal was to leave no skin exposed, because they believed the plague could seep into your pores. The result? You basically wrapped yourself in a personal greenhouse. Most of the time, you couldn't breathe in that suit. Airflow was zero. Flexibility? Forget about it. The material was stiff. Moving felt like wading through glue. You waddled, hunched, dragged your boots through filth and heat, panting into a mask full of mint and misery. Now picture doing that while trying to perform a medical procedure, like lancing an infected bubo, or sticking a pigeon carcass on someone's sores, or shoving vinegar-soaked cloth into a patient's nose while they were convulsing. Your suit slowed you down, dulled your senses, and turned simple tasks into cruel slapstick routines. And here's the part no one talks about: the smell. That suit soaked it up like a sponge. Plague wasn't a clean disease. It smelled like rot, vomit, blood, and despair. Your robe trapped all of it. You could scrub it with vinegar or herbs, sure, but over time, it built up. That leather stank. You stank. Even the other doctors avoided standing downwind. Worse, most plague doctors didn't have multiple suits. You had one, maybe two if your town liked you. That meant day after day, week after week, you wore the same sweat-drenched, blood-spattered armor. It stiffened. It cracked. It started to rot. And by the time it looked like a horror movie prop, so did you. Ever tried disinfecting a full-body waxed leather suit in the Middle Ages? Yeah, they didn't either. And let's not forget the boots. Heavy leather, often ill-fitted. No socks, no support. After walking dozens of miles through infected streets and fields, your feet blistered, bled, and turned purple. Fungus thrived, rats nibbled, and if your boots tore, tough luck. You didn't stop working. You tied some twine around them and hoped your toes made it home. Then there were the gloves, supposedly to protect you while handling patients. In reality, a sad illusion. Most were loose-fitting. Many tore easily. You'd fumble tools, drop bandages, or tear a glove while poking a corpse. That's not a metaphor. That was daily life. Some plague doctors tried to improve the suit. Add extra ties, line the inside with linen, use fancier oils, but nothing really helped. The suit was a medieval hazmat fantasy designed without science, worn without comfort, and remembered for its silhouette rather than its survival rate. You didn't feel like a healer in that thing. You felt like a condemned man playing dress-up, a walking myth, a costume party attendee at the world's worst funeral. And in winter, the wax cracked, the leather stiffened, your joints froze. You moved like a rusted puppet. In summer, it trapped so much heat you could faint mid-sentence. Some plague doctors passed out in alleyways. Some vomited in their masks. Some just disappeared, wandered off, delirious, and never came back. And yet, the suit gave you power. People feared it. Children hid. Doors slammed. Crowds parted. In a city drowning in chaos, you looked like control, like death in order. But the truth? You were just another fool in a costume, pretending you understood the rules, pretending you could survive. And the only thing worse than the suit was who hired you to wear it. You didn't apply for this job. You were summoned. When the plague came to town, it didn't knock, it crashed through the gates. And when the bodies started piling up, the mayors, bishops, and city councils started panicking. They needed a doctor. Or at least someone they could call a doctor. That's where you came in. You might have been a barber, a second-rate surgeon, a university dropout, maybe even a failed apothecary with a reputation for being a little too experimental. Didn't matter. If you had a pulse and a robe, and you weren't actively on fire, they'd hand you a contract. Your employer? Usually the town itself. Not a hospital, not a noble patron, the entire town. A desperate, terrified collective of officials hoping your presence alone would make them look like they were doing something. They'd make it sound official. You will attend to the sick. You will examine the afflicted. You will record cases, prescribe remedies, and maintain public order. Sounds noble, right? But read the fine print, assuming you could. You weren't guaranteed protection. You weren't guaranteed medicine. And you certainly weren't guaranteed payment until the plague ended. Which meant if the disease wiped out the treasury before payday, you worked for free. Some towns sweetened the deal. They'd offer food, lodging, maybe a bonus if you didn't die. A few offered life insurance policies payable to your heirs, assuming you had any. Which was ironic, because most plague doctors didn't live long enough to need a will. Others offered something darker, rights to the property of the deceased. You want a dead man's boots, his house, his chicken coop? It's yours if you survive long enough to claim it. This turned the profession into something else entirely, a scavenger hunt, a macabre auction. Some plague doctors didn't just attend the sick, they inventoried their possessions. A good death record wasn't just for the town's archives, it was your receipt. And that made people suspicious. Imagine a guy in a bird mask showing up, poking around your dying grandma, and then asking how many goats she owns. It didn't exactly inspire confidence, which leads to another problem. You were rarely welcomed. In most towns, you were watched like a hawk, followed, judged. Whispers of, "Is he even a real doctor?" spread like, well, the plague. Some cities required you to carry a letter of employment, stamped with wax, proving you were authorized to examine corpses and interact with the dying. If you didn't have it, you could be mistaken for a thief, or worse, a spy spreading disease on purpose. In some cases, cities tried to assign plague doctors their own guards, not for protection from disease, but from the people. They were scared of you. They thought you brought bad luck. Or worse, that you were in league with whatever force had cursed their city. And still, cities kept hiring. Why? Because even a bad doctor was better than no doctor. You were a symbol, a political shield. When towns wrote letters to neighboring cities begging for aid, they'd mention, "Don't worry, we have a plague doctor." Order is maintained. Never mind that you were 3 days away from collapse, treating patients with garlic paste and blind hope. And who supervised you? No one. There was no plague doctor certification board, no guild, no Hippocratic oversight committee. You were autonomous, unsupervised, and often completely overwhelmed. That meant if you wanted to invent a new treatment, say, stuffing a toad in someone's shoe to draw out the sickness, you could, and some did. Of course, some towns wanted more than just a healer. They wanted a scapegoat. When the plague didn't stop, someone had to take the blame. And who better than the masked man paid to handle it? Some doctors were driven out. Some were stoned. Some just vanished, their names scratched out of town records. But others became legends. Not because they cured anyone, but because they stayed. Because they didn't run. Because in a city of silence and screams, the tap of your cane on cobblestones meant that someone was still alive, still counting, still trying. And yet, as noble as that sounds, there was one problem that never went away. Your paycheck was a trap. Here's the cruelest part of the job. The better you were at surviving, the less likely you were to get paid. Most plague doctors were hired on contracts, not hourly wages, not monthly salaries. Contracts. And those contracts usually included one terrifying little clause: payment upon the conclusion of the plague. Think about that. Your money only came after the plague ended. So every time you treated another infected patient, every time you logged another death, you were essentially working on credit a tab that may never be settled. If the town collapsed, no payment. If your employer died, no payment. If the plague dragged on for years, well, better hope you packed lunch. Some doctors negotiated better deals. A few high-profile ones, like the infamous Dr. George Ray in Edinburgh during the 1600s, were promised a fortune, 4 times a typical physician's salary. Sounds great, right? Except he never saw a penny of it. The plague ended. The city said thanks and promptly refused to pay. They argued that since he survived, he must not have done enough. He sued. They stalled. Years passed. He died. Broke. He wasn't alone. Across Europe, plague doctors were ghosted by their employers. The problem was always the same. Money disappears during a crisis. Cities went bankrupt. Treasuries ran dry. Officials who hired you either fled, died, or suddenly forgot the terms they'd signed when they were panicking. And it gets worse. Some towns actually delayed declaring the end of the plague not because people were still dying, but because once it was officially over, they'd have to pay you. So instead, they dragged their feet. Pretended new cases were unrelated, reworded public statements. Meanwhile, you kept working, kept risking your life, kept waiting. In some cities, doctors turned to alternative income, if you can call it that. They charged grieving families for last rites. They sold vinegar, soaked amulets. They hawked potions made of onion, urine, and unicorn horn, which was usually narwhal tusk. Did it help? Of course not. But when the plague doctor's purse was empty, desperation sold well. And let's not forget what didn't cost money: your burial. In many towns, if a plague doctor died, they weren't buried with ceremony. No headstone, no procession. Often, no family. You were just another infected corpse tossed into a pit, your mask burned, your name scratched into a ledger if they remembered it. Some cities promised otherwise. If you fall in service to the people, they said, you will be buried with honor. What they meant was, we'll dump you slightly deeper than the others. This broke many plague doctors. Morally, mentally, financially, and yet, some stayed. Why? Because for a few, the rare, the strange, the stubborn, it wasn't about the money. It was about legacy. In Italy, one plague doctor kept writing case notes so detailed that centuries later, they became key documents in understanding how the plague moved. In France, another refused to flee when the village priest died and took over both medical and spiritual duties, alone. In England, One physician refused to be paid until every patient in his parish recovered. He never took a shilling. These men, and occasionally women, became legends, but not because they were paid, because they didn't need to be. Still, most weren't legends. Most just needed a roof, food, and a promise. And when that promise broke, some plague doctors quit mid-plague. They took off the mask, tossed it in the mud, and walked away. Others wrote angry letters to the town council, blaming them for chaos. One reportedly nailed his mask to a church door like some grim anti-sermon. "I have seen too much," he wrote, "and cured too little." But if you stayed, if you survived, if you finally saw the bell stop tolling, that was when your real work began counting the cost. Writing the death registers, estimating the losses, rebuilding the health ordinances, sometimes even designing the next plague strategy. You became part bureaucrat, part priest, part undertaker. The mask came off, but the eyes didn't stop seeing. And yet, for all your service, all your sacrifice, one thing always hung over your head: the fear that you might be next. You could do everything right, wear the suit, burn the clothes, boil the instruments, even sniff flowers till your nose bled, and still the plague could find you. Because here's the terrifying truth about being a plague doctor: you were never really safe. The mask was symbolic. The robe was crude armor. The stick you carried? Sometimes it was used to prod patients, but more often it was used to keep your distance. Tap a body, nudge open a door, point at a bubo without getting too close. But there was always something closer. The breath, the cough, the rats, the fleas. The plague, whether it was the bubonic form, from flea bites, the septicemic form, bloodborne, or the pneumonic strain, airborne, didn't care about your mask or your herbs. It slipped through stitches, it clung to your gloves, it rode in on your sleeves. Some doctors lasted weeks, some days. A few made it through the entire outbreak, but that was often dumb luck, not skill. You were playing roulette with a blood-slick barrel. Every house call was a gamble. And the symptoms, oh, you knew them better than anyone. First came the headache, the deep fatigue, the sudden fever. Then, the bubo's swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck. They turned purple, then black, then they burst. The skin turned to parchment, the body seized, the mind unraveled. And for you, the doctor, that wasn't just theory, it was a countdown, because you'd seen it happen again and again. You'd watched it claim the baker, the priest, the mayor, the midwife, and the boy who used to sweep the church steps. It didn't matter who they were. The symptoms were always the same. And if you started to feel off, if your pulse skipped, your hands trembled, or your stomach turned sour, that was the beginning. You might hide it. Doctors did. Especially those who'd made it this far. They wouldn't tell anyone, wouldn't risk being locked away, or worse, burned in their own robes by terrified villagers. You'd keep working, keep moving, keep telling yourself it was just the heat, just a bad night's sleep, just stress. Until it wasn't. Some plague doctors wrote letters home in secret, just in case. Final words, confessions, warnings. A few kept diaries, and in their final entries, you can read the shift. Slight fever today. Odd swelling in the groin. Shall examine further. 2 pages later, I feel it coming. I will try to treat myself. Final page, nothing. That was the other curse of the job. You didn't just witness death, you anticipated your own. You walked through alleys littered with corpses, knowing you might be one tomorrow. You examined patients, holding your breath. You washed your hands in vinegar and prayed. And maybe, just maybe, you started to change. Some plague doctors grew cold, detached. They stopped recording names, started counting corpses like firewood. 17 today, mostly children. 1 noble, all burned. Others grew desperate, turned to wild cures. One buried himself waist-deep in garlic and goose fat every night. Another insisted on drinking his own urine. A third refused to touch patients, instead shouting instructions from across the street. Some snapped entirely. There are reports, though, rare of plague doctors abandoning their posts, running into the woods, screaming that death was chasing them in the shape of a dog. One wandered into the sea. Another was found talking to the bones of his former patients, convinced they were answering. And yet, a few held on. They kept their journals, kept walking the streets, kept offering a gloved hand, a tincture, a word of comfort. Even when their own faces grew pale, even when the coughing started. There's something deeply tragic about that kind of resolve. The kind where you know you're doomed, but you keep going anyway. Because if you don't, who will? And here's the final twist. If you did survive, if the fever broke and you lived through the sores, the pain, the long shadows, you weren't welcome back. You were marked. Survivors were feared, watched, suspected of being unclean, cursed, or unnatural. Some were chased out of town. Others were ordered to burn their belongings, swear oaths, and prove with testimony and coin that they were plague-free. One doctor wrote, "I have defeated the sickness, but I think it has defeated me all the same, because even survival came at a cost. And sometimes that cost was being haunted by everything you saw." But not all ghosts wore hoods or floated in alleys. Some of them bled. You didn't just treat the dying. Sometimes you were asked to watch them die on purpose. See, not every plague death was a quiet surrender. Some were ugly, violent, delirious, and in certain cities, your job wasn't just to comfort the infected. It was to identify who couldn't be saved and get them out of the way. It started with something called a mark. If a patient was beyond help, covered in black sores, coughing blood, burning with fever, and screaming at walls, you were expected to chalk an X on the door. In some places, you used red paint. In others, a handful of straw tied to the handle. Everyone knew what it meant. Don't go in, don't go near. Inside, a person was dying. But they were no longer a person to the town, they were a source of infection, of fear, of potential riot, and now, of policy. In some cities, plague doctors had the authority to quarantine entire homes. You'd nail the doors shut, postcards, leave food on the steps, and pray no one inside started breaking the windows for air. If that sounds cruel, it was. But it was also common. Some doctors were even ordered to report symptoms, not just confirmed plague, but anything close. Sneeze wrong in front of the wrong person, and you might find your house sealed from the outside. No trial, no warning, no exit. In London, the rule was clear. If the plague showed up on your street, the healthy were to stay home for 40 days or else. And who enforced that? Often, the plague doctor. You became a jailer, a health inspector, a quiet executioner. And when the death toll rose too fast, when corpses outnumbered coffins, cities turned to plague pits, mass graves dug outside city walls. And guess who got to supervise the dumping? That's right, you. You'd count the bodies, write down whatever names you could get from neighbors or relatives. Then you'd watch as they were tossed in no prayer, no procession, just a heap of limbs and cloth, covered in lime and dirt. And if someone wasn't dead yet, if they were writhing, moaning, clearly in agony, some doctors looked away. Others argued to wait. A few, a very few, followed orders and said nothing as the earth swallowed the living. There are whispered reports in 17th century records, anonymous accounts of plague doctors forced to accelerate the process. One wrote, "It is worse to let them linger than to end it." Another described holding a cloth over a patient's mouth for mercy. Whether those stories are true or embellished by guilt, no one knows. But the fear was real. People started seeing the plague doctor not as a healer, but as a harbinger, a bringer of bad news, or worse, of death itself. Children cried at the sight of your mask. Mothers begged you not to visit. Some people, if they heard you were coming, fled into the woods and never came back. And you? You started to believe it too. Because sometimes your presence meant the end. Not because you killed them, but because the disease was always faster than you, smarter, more ruthless. You saw patterns others missed, entire families wiped out in days, street names that vanished from maps, rats fleeing neighborhoods hours before the first symptoms appeared. You watched survivors lose their minds. Grief was a storm, and it never stopped raining. And if you tried to sound the alarm, to warn the city council, to beg for better housing, more firewood, cleaner water, fewer rats, you were told, just keep counting. So you counted. Deaths, houses, miles walked, lives ruined. But you also started counting the moments when something felt off. The house where no one opened the door, the street where all the cats were gone, the way the smell changed from sour to metallic. Because sometimes, plague didn't just take a body, it took something else. And what that something was, we'll get to next. It started with smells. You knew the scent of plague. Everyone did. The rot, the bile, the dry crackle of bed sheets stained with fear. But sometimes, there were other smells. Metallic, sharp, wrong. And they came before the sickness, before the fever, before the screams. The dogs barked at nothing. The crows circled empty fields. The air went still. And then the plague came. You began to wonder, was the sickness just a disease? Because some people died with strange marks, not just buboes or rashes, but lines, burnt-looking trails up the spine, circular patterns on the chest, blackened fingertips that seemed to crumble like ash, even when the person had never touched fire. You recorded them, diligently, quietly. But your notes went missing. And not just yours. You started hearing from other doctors, those who survived long enough to write that their journals were being taken, by local priests, by town leaders, by someone who didn't want the records complete. Because there was something deeper beneath the plague, something no one wanted to speak aloud. Let's go back to the birds. The plague doctor mask wasn't just for protection, it was for symbolism. You wore the beak like a shield, stuffed it with herbs to purify the air, yes, but also because it was supposed to mimic the vulture, the eternal witness of death. But sometimes you wondered, who was watching you? Patients would stare through you, not at your mask, through it, as if they were seeing something behind you. Some cried out names. Others started whispering things, not prayers, but warnings. One man gasped with his final breath, "You're not a man. You're it. You're what it wants." You shook it off, until another said it, and another. And then a woman, young, untouched by fever, brought in to care for her brother, looked at you and screamed, not in pain, not in fear, but in recognition, as if she saw something she knew under the mask, something ancient, something not human. That night, you didn't sleep. You checked your skin, your eyes, your reflection. You took off the mask, stared at yourself for hours, convinced your pupils had changed, that your nails were darker, that your voice echoed too long in the room. You burned your clothes, washed with lye, boiled your hands until they blistered. Still, the feeling didn't go away. You started walking differently, avoiding your own shadow, speaking less. People said you looked thinner, taller, more hollow. Then the dreams came. Not dreams, exactly. Echoes. Nights where you'd lie in bed and hear breathing, not yours. Nights where your mask sat on the table and tilted when you looked away. Nights where you woke up standing in the street, covered in ash, with no memory of leaving your bed. The dreams always ended the same way. A mirror, a reflection, and nothing staring back. You tried to leave the city once, packed your things, walked to the gates, but the guards wouldn't let you pass. Doctor stays with the city, they said, until the last case dies. But the plague is gone, you argued. They didn't blink. It's not, one replied. You are. And that's when you began to understand. Maybe the plague wasn't just a disease. Maybe it was a pattern, a force, a rhythm that pulsed through time, and someone had to keep the beat. Someone had to wear the mask. And the longer you wore it, the less you remembered what it was like to take it off. But it wasn't over. Because if the plague could change you, what could it do to the world? And what was coming next? Then came the second plague. Not a new outbreak, not yet. Not a wave of disease in the lungs or blackened skin. Number. This one was quieter, slower. It didn't strike the body, it struck the mind. It started with the bell ringers, the ones who walked the streets calling out the dead. For months, they'd trudged through alleys and churchyards, tolling the iron bell. Ding, ding, bring out your dead. Until one day, they stopped. Not because the dead had stopped coming, but because the ringers began hearing echoes. They said the bell was ringing before they struck it, that the sound came from the sky, that it vibrated through their teeth and showed them faces of people not yet dead. One ran screaming into the cathedral, tearing at his ears. Another leapt into a grave halfway dug. The rest vanished. No farewell, just bells found lying in the street. Next came the grave diggers, tough men, blunt, numb to rot. But one by one, they started refusing to work at night. Shadows are wrong, they said. Pits too deep. One described hearing whispers, but not from above. From below. Like the dead want to tell us something, he muttered before never returning again. And then, the dreams spread. You'd seen plague patients before, delirious from fever, but this was different. These were healthy people, officials, clergy, even children, all reporting the same thing. Dark corridors, robed figures, and the sound of breathing behind the walls. Some drew pictures, always the same. A towering figure in black, beaked face, gloved hands, watching. Sound familiar? They were dreaming you. You tried to dismiss it. Coincidence, panic, leftover fear from a brutal year. But then someone handed you a drawing. A child, no more than 5. I saw him last night, he whispered. And there it was. Your mask, your robes. But the proportions were wrong. Too tall, arms too long, fingers tapering into claws, and the eyes not glass but hollow. You didn't take the drawing home. You burned it. That night, the air felt different. The mask on your table shifted slightly when you turned your back. And in the morning, a knock at the door. Not a cry for help, not a messenger. Just a man in robes, a new plague doctor. Your service is done, he said. You blinked. There's no contract, you replied. No successor. He smiled, just slightly. There is now. And as he turned, you saw the bag, the mask, the gloves. Yours. Only older, darker, like they'd been worn through centuries. He walked away, and the moment he left your sight, he was gone. Just like that. You never saw another patient, never heard another cough. The city recovered mostly. Trade resumed, streets cleaned. People whispered that the worst had passed, but they still crossed themselves when they saw you, still whispered when you walked by. And somewhere deep inside you, you knew it hadn't ended. It had just changed form. The mask you used to wear, you don't need it anymore. Because now, when people look at you, they flinch. They look away. And when you sleep, you dream of bells. You dream of black tunnels. And you dream of yourself walking through them endlessly, cloak dragging through dust, searching for something. The plague may be gone, but the plague doctor, he never leaves. You thought the horror would stop once the sickness faded. But the plague wasn't just a killer, it was a mirror. And once you'd looked into it, once you'd watched a city rot from the inside, the reflection never quite left you. Because even after the death carts rolled away and the bells stopped ringing, the scars were everywhere. Start with the people. You remember their faces, the ones who lived and the ones who changed. There was the baker's son, always laughing, always covered in flour. When the plague hit, he hid in the cellar, survived. But when you saw him again weeks later, he didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared out the window, whispering the same thing over and over. It's still here. It never left. Or the mother who lost all 3 children in 1 week. You found her in the churchyard, digging holes with her bare hands, her fingers bleeding. She wasn't digging graves. She was digging doors. "Let me in," she kept saying. "They're not gone, just somewhere colder." You didn't stop her, because you weren't sure she was wrong. The city moved on, at least pretended to. Markets reopened. Churches held mass. Officials declared the plague over. But people looked different. They acted different. No laughter, no lingering in the streets, no children playing past dusk. The joy had been bled out. And in its place was something brittle. You started noticing other things. Candles left burning in windows all night, every night, even when no one was home. Bundles of herbs nailed to doorways, far past the season for plague. Marks scratched into stone walls, not graffiti, not decoration. Symbols, repeated patterns, always 3 lines down, 1 across, like a tally or a warning. You asked about them once. An old woman just stared at you. "They say if you stop counting," she said, "it finds you." Even the birds were strange. Fewer crows, fewer rats. But the pigeons, they never left. Just sat, silently watching from rooftops, dozens of them, all facing the same direction, toward the graveyard. And there, the earth never settled. You'd walk past, weeks after the last burial, and still the ground bulged, as if it remembered, as if it breathed. Some people said they heard music in the night, faint flutes, low chanting, always from the outskirts, always just far enough away that you couldn't prove it. You tried once, went out with a lantern, alone. Nothing. But when you came back, your boots were soaked with mud, except it hadn't rained in days, and your hands shaking. After that, you stopped asking questions. But the worst part? The other doctors. Some of them never took off the mask, even when the plague ended, even when their families begged, even when they stood in line for bread, breathing perfectly clean air. They'd nod, grunt, wave with gloved hands, but they never removed the beak. One said it helped him see clearer. Another said he couldn't remember his real face. And one just laughed. "You think I was wearing the mask?" he said. "It was wearing me. After that, you burned yours. Every stitch, every scrap. You tossed the ashes into the river, But sometimes, at night, when you pass a dark alley or a foggy window, you see it. Not on your face, but standing there. Still, watching, waiting. Because the plague might be gone from the body. But in your mind, it never left. By now, you're probably wondering, why would anyone choose this job? Why wear the beak? Why sign up to be death's assistant, society's scapegoat, and history's most unlucky physician? The truth? Most of them didn't choose it. Let's go back. The image of the plague doctor tall hat, waxed robe, terrifying bird mask feels iconic now. But in the 14th, 15th, even 17th centuries, plague doctors were rarely famous. They weren't trusted. They weren't respected. They were desperate. Some were junior physicians, young, ambitious, looking to prove themselves when no one else wanted the job. Others were outcasts, foreigners, immigrants, people already on the margins of society offered coin in exchange for risking their lives. Sometimes, it wasn't even doctors at all. It was barbers, butchers, failed apothecaries, anyone willing to put on the mask and pretend. City councils, and remember, most towns had no proper medical system, would draft contracts. They'd hire a plague doctor like a mercenary. You'd get a small salary, a place to stay, often a shack outside town, and sometimes bonus pay for each day you stayed alive. But there was a catch. Once you accepted the job, you couldn't leave. Not until the plague burned itself out or burned you out. Doctors were often locked inside infected zones. If they tried to flee, they could be arrested. In Venice, plague doctors were forcibly quarantined at the end of each outbreak, held for weeks on a nearby island, just in case they'd brought the sickness with them. And don't think they were getting rich either. Some were promised pensions never paid. Others were given land or titles, then stripped of them when politics changed. More than a few died in debt, buried in unmarked graves. One famous plague doctor, Matthias Hasper, treated over 500 patients during the 1629 outbreak in Milan. His contract promised lifelong support for his family. When he died of plague a month later, the city council claimed they couldn't confirm his services and paid nothing. And yet, some still volunteered. Why? Because in a world where medicine was superstition and disease was judgment from heaven, plague doctors weren't just healers, they were symbols. Symbols of resistance, of hope, of defiance, in the face of the unknowable. Villagers would carve small wooden effigies of them. Children would run beside them, mimicking the beak. Priests would pray for them in mass, even as they blamed them for spreading the sickness. They were walking contradictions, both feared and needed, mocked and mourned, shunned and sanctified. And for the doctors themselves, many left no journals, no letters, just names on city records, scribbled in beside burial notes or salary disputes. Their stories are lost. But a few left traces. One wrote, "If I cannot stop death, I will at least witness it." Another scribbled in Latin, "Ego sum umbra," I am the shadow. These weren't healers, they were historians of horror, living archives. And their presence, their terrifying masks and strange robes, became humanity's attempt to look death in the face and not blink. Even if that face was your own reflection in a cracked, fogged mirror. And here's the twist. Some people say the plague doctor never really went away. Not as a person, but as a symbol. He still appears in masks at carnivals, in paintings, in nightmares, and sometimes in cities where sickness creeps through streets again, in times of panic. When no one knows what's real and what's rumor, people claim to see him. Standing on rooftops, watching, waiting, because maybe death wears many faces. but we only gave one to the doctor who followed behind it. You might assume that after all this, the trauma, the death, the loneliness, the life of a plague doctor ended quietly. But in some cases, it didn't end at all. Let's talk about the after. The plague doctor, when his job was done, when the bells stopped and the streets cleared, didn't just return to normal life. There was no normal. Imagine it. You've spent years wrapped in waxed linen and nightmares. You've seen children coughing up blood, mothers wailing over still cribs, rats crawling through rib cages, and priests blessing unmarked pits. You've lost count of the dead. And now, you're expected to just go back, to open a shop, to marry, to walk through a market without turning your head at every cough. But your body doesn't forget. Many plague doctors suffered what we'd now call post-traumatic stress. But in the 1600s, no one had language for it. You were simply changed, distant, touched. Some became hermits, withdrawing from public life. Others drifted between towns, never staying long, their masks left behind but the stare still fixed. A few returned to medicine but not with patience. They became scholars, anatomists, historians of death. And some vanished. There's a record from 1720 in Marseille, just after the Great Plague ended, of a doctor who walked out of the quarantine zone and disappeared, left his salary, left his mask, left a journal open to one sentence. The mask was never mine. No one ever saw him again. Others became legends. In Naples, there's a statue of a man in robes with no face, only a mirror where the head should be. Locals call him Il Testimone, the witness. Some say he was a plague doctor who treated the poor for free and died with a smile. Others claim he still walks the alleys on moonless nights, checking homes for illness that hasn't struck yet. In Prague, there's a 17th century inn that claims to have hosted a former plague doctor. According to the guest book, he paid in foreign coins minted years before he was born. When questioned, he simply said, "I've been through worse places." But these stories, as haunting as they are, reflect something deeper. The plague doctor didn't just witness death, he became part of it. People started to believe the mask itself held power, that the waxed cloak and the beaked face had absorbed too much, too many screams, too much suffering, and couldn't be worn without consequence. In some towns, masks were burned after the plague ended. In others, they were locked away in churches or buried with lime like cursed relics. One mask, kept in a museum in Vienna, was found years later to have scratches on the inside, deep gouges, like someone had tried to tear it off but couldn't. Visitors report hearing breathing in the room. The staff doesn't talk about it. But here's the thing, we don't need superstition to understand what happened. The plague doctor became a myth because he had to. People needed a symbol, something to fear, something to thank, something to blame. He was all three. He still is. Think about it, when the world faces new diseases, new unknowns, the image comes back. The mask, the beak, the black silhouette in the fog. Not because it's useful, because it's familiar. In a world where we can't stop death, we dress it up, we give it a costume, we draw a line around the horror and say, this is what it looks like. And for centuries, that horror looked like a plague doctor. Maybe it still does. You thought the robes were for protection. You thought the beak was for herbs. You thought the gloves were just gloves. But what if they weren't? What if the plague doctor's costume wasn't just practical but ritual? Let's take a closer look. That terrifying outfit, long coat, black hat, glass-eyed beak didn't appear during the Black Death in the 1300s. It was codified later, in the 1600s, designed by Charles Delorme, a French physician to royalty. He wanted something that could shield doctors from miasma, the bad air people believed spread plague. So he designed a second skin, The coat was waxed leather or canvas, sealed tight at every opening. The gloves were stitched to the sleeves. The boots were tall and oiled. The hat was wide-brimmed to signify medical authority. And the mask? The infamous beak? That was the filter. It was stuffed with herbs, lavender, mint, camphor, cloves, anything believed to cleanse the air. And it worked, at least in theory. But here's the part no one talks about. People didn't fear the plague doctor because he looked ridiculous. They feared him because he looked inhuman. Children cried. Adults crossed the street. Some claimed he carried death in his robes, like smoke clinging to cloth. Others whispered that if you saw the doctor outside your door, it meant someone inside was already dead. Or worse, soon would be. The outfit blurred the line between man and omen. And when fear lingers long enough, it starts to rewrite reality. Some towns believed the mask itself had power, that the herbs inside weren't just to purify air but to trap spirits, a kind of net, a portable exorcism. There are records of doctors being buried with their masks nailed shut to keep what was inside from getting out. Others swore the beak could smell sin, that it twitched near the unrepentant. One priest claimed he saw a doctor's mask turn on its own, unprompted, to face a dying thief as if sniffing out guilt. And the robe? It wasn't just a coat, it was armor. Not against plague, but against what came with it. Fever dreams, murmured names, figures in the mist. By the late 17th century, plague doctors weren't just medics. They were ritual specialists. Cities sent them not just to heal, but to cleanse, to walk infected alleys and ward off the dark. In some regions of Italy, when a town fell silent, when the rats vanished, and the dogs howled at nothing, people lit candles and prayed for the arrival of a plague doctor. Not to cure, to contain. In Venice, a document from 1631 describes a plague doctor who refused to remove his mask, even while eating. He was found dead one morning, seated at the table, untouched food before him, a single word scratched into the wood. Guardiano, the watcher. Another doctor in Lyon kept a pouch of grave dust sewn into his hymn. He claimed it protected him. When he died, not from plague, but from falling into an empty well, the dust was gone. Only his robe remained. Still folded, still warm. And here's the strangest part. We remember them not by name, but by shape. The outline, the silhouette, that looming curved beak, the face of death's assistant. The costume was supposed to protect them from the plague, but in the end, it protected us from what they became. From what we might become if we stared too long into the eyes of mass death and tried to understand it. The plague doctor wasn't a man. He was a mask that stared back. There's a story, one you'll never find in medical textbooks. Whispers pass between generations, from gravedigger to night watchman to the last plague doctor who ever wore the mask. They called it the doctor's curse. It goes like this. A long time ago, when the plague first swept through Europe like a black tide, a physician in a small walled town, no name given, just the doctor, made a vow. He would save everyone. Not just some, not just the rich, everyone. He built a room behind his house, lined the walls with herbs, scriptures, stones carved with protective glyphs. He read ancient texts, called in monks, even paid a dowser to balance the air. His mask, longer than most, shaped almost like a hawk's beak, was filled with a dozen herbs, swapped out hourly. Every day, he walked the town, and every day, the town died. But he didn't stop. He tended to patients others wouldn't touch. He took in children, burned linens, performed blessings. Some say he even practiced alchemy, tried to turn blackened blood to gold, and he never got sick. As weeks became months, fear turned to awe. People came to believe he wasn't just resistant, he was protected. Some whispered divine, Others whispered damned. Then one night, a boy knocked on his door, face pale, eyes wide. "My mother," he said. "She's coughing up dust." The doctor followed, but when he entered the house, it was empty. No mother, no boy, just a mask. His mask, lying on the floor, still warm. He reached for it and vanished. The next morning, the townspeople found the doctor's home abandoned. No body, no bag, no sign of a struggle, except for footprints muddy, backward leading from the house into the fog. They say he's still walking, that when plague returns, so does he. Sometimes wearing his mask, sometimes becoming it. Because the curse was this: to care for the sick, even after the world forgot him, to walk between the living and the dead, to carry the weight of broken promises and untreatable wounds forever. And here's the chilling part. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, a nurse in Spain reported a man outside the quarantine tent, wearing a coat too long, a hat too wide, and a curved beak-like mask. She thought it was a costume, until she blinked and he was gone. No footprints, no shadow, just the sound of coughing in the wind. The plague doctor isn't dead. He doesn't need to be. He's an idea, a shape, a memory we summon when we're afraid. He's what appears when medicine fails and mystery takes over. And maybe, just maybe, he's what waits for us at the edge of every outbreak. A figure in black, a mirror with no reflection, a reminder that some masks, once worn, never come off. Let's talk about the smell. Because plague wasn't just a sight or a fear, it was an odor that got into your bones. The stench of rot, of bodies in heat, of sweat-soaked linen never washed, of open sores, bursting pus, of rats gnawing through food and flesh, of fear, which has a scent too sharp, sour, metallic. As a plague doctor, you didn't smell once. You smelled forever. You smelled it in the rooms you entered, rank with decay, windows nailed shut to keep the bad air out, trapping every breath of death inside. You smelled it on the patients' their breath, like spoiled wine and meat left too long in the sun. You smelled it on yourself in the folds of your robe, in the straw padding of your hat, in your gloves soaked from the inside with sweat and filth. And no matter how many herbs you stuffed into the beak, it never went away. The nose remembered. Some doctors started chewing mint just to have a new flavor in their mouth. Others stuffed rags into their nostrils beneath the mask. One even kept a slice of lemon in his beak, replacing it daily. Eventually, it rotted too. You see, the plague didn't just kill the body. It tried to erase identity. Doctors stopped smelling like people. They became walking sacks of mold, wax, old leather, and rot. It was said that when a doctor entered a home, even the healthy would gag not from illness, but from him. Some took to burning incense as they walked, trailing smoke behind them like some cursed priest of pestilence. But here's where it gets worse. The smell, it started to follow you, even outside, even after you left the house, even when no one else noticed it. One doctor wrote in his journal, "I have washed, I have burned my clothes, I have moved to new lodgings, but the scent returns, in dreams, in sleep, on mornings when the wind is still. It waits for me, it wants me to remember." Another wrote that he hadn't smelled roses in 20 years. Even when he held them to his face, all he could smell was pus. Some theorized that the plague changed, the brain rewired the senses. That constant exposure to trauma burned new tracks into the mind, carving memory into odor. Modern science calls it olfactory PTSD. But back then, they called it the mark. They believed once you smelled the Black Death, truly inhaled it, it marked you. Some even said you started to smell like it. Not to yourself, but to others. That's why some plague doctors were refused entry to homes even after outbreaks ended. Not because they might still be sick, because people could smell the death on them. It clung like guilt, like a shadow, a scent that no soap, no herb, no prayer could wash away. One final note. In Venice, there's a sealed chamber in an old hospital, long abandoned. The door is chained shut, the key lost. Locals say it's because the air inside never cleared. That long after the bodies were removed, the smell remained. That once you open it, the plague remembers. So when you see those old paintings, the figure in black, the long beak, the gloved hand outstretched, remember? He wasn't just fighting disease. He was breathing it. He carried it in his lungs, in his coat, in his dreams. And when he slept, if he ever slept, he dreamed not in color or sound or shape. He dreamed in smell. So what happened when the plague finally ended? The streets emptied. The bells stopped ringing. The carts no longer clattered with the weight of the dead. And the plague doctor? He walked away, or tried to. But what kind of life was left for a man who had lived in the mask? The robe came off. The beak was hung or buried. The gloves were burned. But the man beneath? Scarred, changed, not quite part of the world anymore. See, the townspeople had short memories and long fears. They no longer wanted the doctor near them, not in the market, not at church, not at their table. He reminded them of what they had tried to forget. He smelled like sorrow. He looked like everything they prayed would never return. And so, many plague doctors became pariahs. One doctor, Jean Vallet, was denied entry to the city he had saved. He wrote in a letter, "I saw 3,000 people to their graves, and now they won't open the gate for me." Another in Vienna found his name struck from the medical register. No longer trustworthy, the notes read not because of scandal, but because he had touched too much death. The irony? He'd survived what few others had. But in surviving, he had crossed a line from healer to ghost. Some tried to write books, treatises on plague, on treatments, on anatomy. Most were ignored. Others turned to quiet trades, apiculture, scribal work, gardening, alone. And many simply disappeared. Because when the world moves on, it needs to leave symbols behind. You can't build a happy town square with a walking reminder of agony standing in it. So the plague doctor became a memory, then a myth. A shape painted on tavern signs, a costume at carnival balls, a figure in children's rhymes, and then somehow an icon. By the 1800s, people wore the mask as mockery, a joke from a safer time. They laughed at the beak, at the long robe, at the silly idea that you could fight a disease with herbs and leather. They forgot that behind that beak was a man who watched whole villages die, that the joke mask had once been soaked in sweat, that the funny shape had once stood alone in the middle of hell. You can find old plague masks in museums now. Velvet ropes separate you from them. Glass cases protect them. Descriptions say, 17th century protective garb. But what they don't say is, this costume buried thousands. This outfit heard last words. This robe saw the end of the world. And maybe, most haunting of all, this mask looked at death every single day and didn't flinch. Because someone had to, even if no one would remember their name. You've seen the mask. You've heard the legend. But do you know what made the plague doctor different from every other physician of his time? He stayed. In an era where nobles fled to the countryside, where priests boarded up their churches, where even family members locked their own kin behind doors, the plague doctor entered. He walked toward the infection. Not because he was brave, not because he was foolish, but because he was paid to. Let's talk about the contract. You see, plague doctors weren't just volunteers or saints. They were hired, men contracted by cities desperate for control. And those contracts? They read like death sentences. Most had fixed durations, 1 year, sometimes 2. During that time, the doctor could not leave the town. Not for illness, not for emergency, not even for family deaths. Some cities offered high salaries, double or triple what a regular doctor might make. Others promised land, titles, or lifelong pensions. But here's the catch. Many never lived long enough to collect. Cities tried to sweeten the deal by offering housing, food, even armed escorts. But nothing could disguise the truth. The job was a gamble, and everyone knew it. Plague doctors were often young, poor, or foreign, outsiders with little to lose. Hiring a local doctor was rare because no one wanted to lose their town physician. So cities imported medics from miles away, men who didn't know the streets, who didn't speak the dialect, who would not be mourned if they didn't return. And it wasn't just the pay that was conditional. Some contracts forbade doctors from touching the sick with bare hands. Others instructed them to burn the belongings of the dead even if the family objected. If they disobeyed, payment could be withheld. One clause from a contract in 1630 Venice reads, "If the doctor shall succumb before his term, his estate shall be forfeit to the council." Even in death, they were owned. And yet, they took the job. Not because they didn't know better, because sometimes that was the only option left. A failed physician, a disgraced academic, a son trying to buy back his family's land. Or, in one recorded case, a man who simply wrote, "I wanted to see if I could stop it." The contract was never about safety. It was about control. The city wanted someone they could point to, someone they could blame when the numbers got worse, someone they could parade through the streets to show, "We are doing something." And the plague doctor? He became that something. A man in a cage of cloth and law, walking through fog and rot, with no one on his side but a few scraps of paper and a mask full of herbs. Some cities even forged contracts posthumously, claiming the doctor died of unrelated causes just to avoid paying his family. Others refused to bury plague doctors in consecrated ground, fearing their bodies still housed the illness. So in the end, the plague doctor wasn't just a healer. He was a pawn, paid to die, then forgotten or worse, blamed for the thing no one could control. But still, he walked. Because someone had to. Now picture this. You're a plague doctor in the 17th century. You've seen the dying. You've buried the dead. You've watched entire streets empty overnight. But there's one part no one warned you about. The accusations. See, in times of mass death, fear mutates. It needs a face, a scapegoat, a target. And sometimes, that target becomes you. It started small. A whispered rumor, a sidelong glance, a neighbor murmuring that they saw you touch a child and then that child died 2 days later. Soon, the questions begin. Why does the doctor never get sick? Why does he carry that bag of powders? What's really in the beak? Then come the darker ones. Is he spreading the plague instead of curing it? Is he marking homes for death? Some even believed plague doctors were summoning the disease, that they carried pestilence like bees carry pollen, transferring death from one house to another with every knock at the door. And it gets worse. In Marseille, 1720, when the last major plague outbreak hit Europe, a rumor spread that plague doctors were poisoning wells secretly employed by foreign powers to weaken the city. Riots broke out. One doctor was dragged from his lodgings and beaten to death with farm tools. His robe was burned in the street. People cheered. In Milan, 1630, officials reported graffiti scrawled outside homes. "Beware the black bird." It wasn't a warning against the plague. It was about you. They thought your beak was a bird's head, that you weren't human anymore, that you came to peck at the living. And sometimes, doctors fought back. One famous physician, Giulio Corti, began carrying a short sword inside his walking stick. Another kept a lead-filled lantern, not just for light but for defense, because if the plague didn't kill you, panic might. There's even a legend from a coastal village in southern Italy. They say a doctor once tried to leave town after months of service. He made it to the edge of the village before he was surrounded by villagers with pitchforks. Not because he was infected, because they believed he was the infection. He vanished. They say if you walk that cliffside at dusk, you can still see a shape in the mist, long coat, curved mask, standing at the edge. Watching. Waiting. It sounds like a ghost story, but here's the truth. When death becomes invisible, people need to see something. And the plague doctor, with his eerie costume, his quiet movements, and his unnatural immunity, became the perfect villain. Not the rats, not the fleas, you. So in addition to fighting disease, you had to fight suspicion. You had to treat patients while glancing over your shoulder. You had to enter homes knowing the very people you were trying to help might one day slam the door, point a finger, and scream, "Witch!" In a time when death was everywhere, survival looked suspicious. And the man who wore the mask to save them became the monster in the mirror. And then just when it couldn't get worse, the plague began to mutate. Not metaphorically, literally. Because this wasn't just one disease. It was a family of terrors. First came the bubonic plague, the one with the swollen lymph nodes, the buboes that blackened and festered beneath the skin. But then came the pneumonic version, and that changed everything. Bubonic plague required fleas and rats to spread. It took time. It could be contained, at least in theory. But pneumonic plague? It was airborne. It moved through coughs, through speech, through shared air in narrow halls and crowded churches. It leapt from person to person like wildfire. And you, the plague doctor, were suddenly more vulnerable than ever. Because no robe, no gloves, no beak stuffed with rosemary and mint could stop a breath. You'd walk into a home, a patient coughing blood into a cloth, and you'd feel it, that warm, humid exhale, heavy with something unseen. You didn't even have to touch them anymore. Just be in the room. Some plague doctors tried to adapt. They sealed their beak tighter, switched herbs more often, added vinegar to the lining of their masks, hoping the acid would kill airborne vapors. Others began treating every breath as an enemy, holding it in, timing their visits like divers, ducking into houses for 30 seconds, scribbling notes, then gasping for air outside. But there's only so long you can go without breathing. One doctor in London in 1665 wrote, "I feel the air thick against my face. It presses like wet cloth, and always, always the breath of the dying finds me." And the worst version? Septicemic plague. It skipped the buboes entirely. No warning signs, just bleeding from the eyes, gums, and under the skin. A full-body shutdown. By the time symptoms showed, it was already too late. You might leave one patient at dawn pale but alert and return by dusk to find them collapsed, bleeding from every orifice, already rotting while still warm. And then it began happening to the doctors. One by one. They'd seem fine in the morning. By nightfall, they were gasping. And the mask, the robe, the rituals, none of it worked. That's when you start hearing the phrase, "The plague has changed." They wrote it in journals, etched it into stone cellars, whispered it in churches. Not ended, not lessened, changed. And that change wasn't just in the disease. It was in the people. The fear deepened, the trust fractured, the violence returned. Now, even the beak mask, couldn't hide your cough. And every time you cleared your throat, someone stared. Every time you leaned against a wall to catch your breath, someone whispered. You weren't just the healer. You were the canary in the coal mine. If the doctor starts dying, then no one is safe. Some physicians abandoned their posts, burned their robes, tossed their masks into rivers and fled north. Others went down with the town coughing through the streets, mask twisted sideways, herbs spilling like feathers from a dying bird. So the next time you see that beaked figure in a museum, ask yourself, was he trying to save the dying? Or was he just the last to realize he was one of them? There was one place where the plague doctor's nightmare reached its peak. Not a city, not a battlefield, an island. Poveglia, a sliver of land off the coast of Venice. You won't find it in travel guides. Tour boats don't stop there. The locals call it cursed. Some don't call it anything at all. But in the 1700s, Poveglia was a dumping ground for the dead, for the dying, and for the plague doctors who had nowhere else to go. Venetian officials, desperate to stop the spread of the disease, turned the island into a quarantine colony, a lazaretto. At first, it was meant to be temporary. Just hold the sick there for a few days. Monitor them. Treat what you could. But the sickness didn't leave. And neither did the patients. Or the doctors. They built makeshift wards from crumbling villas, hauled the sick over in boats, sometimes still alive, sometimes barely breathing, sometimes already dead. And then they left them there. All of them. One plague doctor wrote in his diary, "No one comes for us. No one asks what we need. We are the forgotten now, priests for the dead, prisoners of mercy." He signed it simply M. Over time, the island gained a new name, the Island of the Dead. Estimates say more than 160,000 people died there. Some were burned in open pits, others buried in shallow graves, and many too many were simply left where they fell. Plague doctors tried to impose order. They built pyres, dug trenches, invented rituals to keep their sanity. One wore bells on his ankles to keep spirits away. Another recited prayers backward to confuse the devil. Some started seeing things. They wrote of shadows that didn't match their owners, of voices in the reeds, of black figures walking the grounds without masks, without faces. Most of these accounts were dismissed as madness, fever dreams, paranoia. But then, one journal entry. The mask no longer comes off. No explanation. No context. Just those 6 words, scribbled in a shaking hand. And it wasn't just metaphor. Doctors began reporting phantom pain in their faces even when they weren't wearing the mask. Others claimed they could still smell the herbs days after discarding them. One doctor carved a beak into a wooden plank and nailed it to his wall. He said it was to keep the others away. There are no official records of what happened to the last plague doctors of Poveglia. Just rumors that some burned themselves alive rather than succumb, that others walked into the sea. That one buried himself. In 1968, construction workers digging on the island unearthed a cellar filled with bones, human and animal, tangled together, masked and unmasked, beaks rotted through. At the far end of the chamber, a single word carved into the stone, cura, Latin for care, or possibly cure. No one knows who wrote it. No one knows what they meant. But Poveglia remains closed, a place of silence, a place where even the birds don't sing. And somewhere in the crumbling hospital ruins, they say the beaked shadow still walks, not searching for the sick, searching for the cure he never found. But what if the plague doctor wasn't a doctor at all? What if he was something stranger, a symbol born from fear, then twisted by time into myth. Because here's the secret, no one likes to say out loud, we don't know who all of them were. Yes, some were trained physicians, university educated, armed with theories about humors and miasma. Men who read Galen, scribbled in Latin, and genuinely believed they were helping. But others? Not so much. Records show that many plague doctors weren't doctors at all, not by training, not by experience, not by any stretch of the imagination. They were butchers, barbers, failed medics. One in Marseille had been a wine merchant the year before. Another in Geneva was a known conman who disappeared after the outbreak, and no one ever found the money he was paid. Because when the world is burning, people will take any hand that offers help, even if it's a lie. All you needed was the outfit, the mask, the robe, a cane or a stick, and suddenly you had power. People would let you into their homes. They'd obey your orders. They'd pay you, fearfully, quietly. So is it any surprise that the costume became a magnet for the desperate and the dangerous? There are whispers impossible to prove, that some plague doctors used their role to rob the dead, that others hastened the deaths of the sick to keep their schedules manageable, and a few might have enjoyed the power too much. A 17th century chronicle from Lyon recounts a strange trial. A man in plague garb arrested for impersonating a doctor and laying hands on the daughter of a nobleman. His defense? I was inspecting for buboes. They hanged him anyway. But the damage was done. The plague doctor was no longer just a healer. He was now a bogeyman. Parents told children, behave, or the beak will come for you. Folk songs sprang up dark rhymes about men in bird masks, dragging souls to the underworld. And somewhere along the line, the costume outgrew the role. It became archetype, a shape that meant death, a silhouette that stood at the edge of the firelight. Not a savior, a sentinel. And even today, centuries later, the plague doctor remains unsettling. You see it in art, in masks at Halloween, in memes, in stories. The beaked face with hollow eyes. Why does it still scare us? Because deep down, we recognize it. Not as history, but as a mirror of what fear looks like when it wears a uniform, of how quickly help can become harm, of how even the ones meant to save us can be something else entirely. So maybe the scariest thing about the plague doctor isn't that he was a fraud. It's that sometimes he wasn't. He meant well. He tried. He did his best. And it still wasn't enough. The question we never ask out loud is this: what happened to the last plague doctor? Not the one in Venice. Not the one in London. The final one. The last man to don the mask. What do you do after the world has stopped dying? When the bells no longer toll, when the carts stop coming, when the smoke clears, and the air smells like rain again instead of rot. Do you take off the beak? Do you go home? Assuming there's still a home left. Some say the last plague doctor was a Dutchman, hired by a small town near Amsterdam in 1799, well after the worst waves had ended. He treated 3 patients during a minor outbreak, wrote obsessively about his methods, and insisted on wearing the full traditional outfit. The townspeople laughed at him behind closed shutters. He kept showing up long after the plague passed. Eventually, he stopped taking his pay. He just kept walking the streets, checking the houses, tapping doors with his stick. They say he disappeared one foggy morning. The only thing left was the mask hanging on the chapel door. Others claim the last real plague doctor was never recorded, because by then the mask was obsolete, the robe outdated, the theories disproven. Modern medicine had moved on. Bacteria had names, quarantines had structure, Hospitals had protocols. The world had outgrown the beak, and yet something about it refused to fade. In the 1800s, artists revived the image. Painters depicted plague doctors in nightmarish scenes, part human, part bird, part omen. By the 1900s, the mask began to appear in masquerade balls, at first as satire, then as something else. A statement, a symbol, a memory. And during COVID-19 centuries later, people posted pictures of the plague mask again, made jokes, designed merch. Some even wore it on the streets, not for function, but as irony. Dark humor to cope. And yet, beneath the laughter, a shiver. Because we remembered. We remembered what it meant. Not just a funny costume. Not just a creepy bird. A man who walked through fire so others didn't have to. A man who buried friends. Who heard last words. Who touched death every day and kept going anyway. So maybe the last plague doctor never really vanished. Maybe he still walks in the back of our minds every time the sirens wail, every time the hospitals fill, every time we whisper, "Is it back?" Maybe the mask didn't disappear. Maybe we just stopped needing to look at it until we did again. And when that day comes, when the next shadow rises, when the next breath carries danger, when the air thickens with silence and fear, who will be the one to wear it this time? Because the mask doesn't care who puts it on, only that someone does. Let's rewind for a moment. Back before the beak, before the robes, before the name Plague Doctor even existed. Because long before they became symbols of death, long before they were mythologized into masked reapers, there was a different kind of healer. One who didn't wear waxed fabric. One who didn't carry a cane. One who didn't even call himself a doctor. They were known by many names: healers, wise women, herb masters, cunning folk. And during the earliest outbreaks of plague, especially in the 14th century, these were the people the dying turned to first. Why? Because they were already there. Plague moved faster than royal decrees, faster than organized response. When the first boils rose, when the fevers burned, when the breath went shallow, the person kneeling at the bedside was often someone who lived next door. Someone who knew plants, knew prayers, knew how to mix a poultice or whisper over a wound. And for a time, they worked. Not because they had a cure, but because they were present. They anointed the dying with vinegar and sage. They burned juniper in doorways. They prayed. They comforted. They held hands no one else would touch. And then things changed. As death climbed higher and faster and louder, people wanted answers, wanted scapegoats. And some of these early healers, they knew too much. A midwife who touched the dying but didn't fall ill, suspicious. A widow whose herbal tinctures helped too many people, dangerous. A village herbalist whose potion smelled like salvation or poison. Suddenly, the accusations began. They weren't doctors. They were witches. Trials flared. Fires rose. And some of the same women who once saved lives were now being dragged before inquisitors, forced to confess to crimes against heaven. For mixing herbs. For comforting the sick. For surviving. And so, by the 16th and 17th centuries, a shift occurred. Healing became male, formal, institutional. The robe replaced the shawl. The beak replaced the eye contact. The cane replaced the hand. The plague doctor emerged not just as a physician, but as a response to fear. A professional. An authority. A sanctioned savior, marked by costume and contract. But here's the quiet truth. His roots, his real beginnings, were in the hands of those untrained, uncelebrated, unnamed. And that's the irony. We remember the beak, but not the woman who boiled the thyme, not the monk who tended wounds barefoot, not the child who wiped sweat from their father's brow. Because they wore no mask, no robe, no title, just compassion. And maybe, just maybe, they saved more lives than the man in the mask ever could. So now we arrive at the strangest part of the story. Not the death, not the disease, not even the beak, but the legacy. Because while plague doctors vanished from the streets centuries ago, their image didn't disappear. It multiplied. And it took on a life of its own long after the plague was gone. Today, the beaked mask shows up in the most unexpected places. Venetian carnival masks, hand-painted and glittered, turned a symbol of death into an icon of spectacle. You'll find them in shop windows, along cobbled alleys, sold to tourists who have no idea they're buying the face of a 17th century funeral priest. In tattoos, the plague doctor has become a gothic totem, part punk, part priest, part survivor. A figure that says, "I've walked through hell and I'm still standing." He appears in video games as a healer, a villain, a ghost, in horror films, in cosplays, on t-shirts, on candle labels, in haunted house attractions. In 2020, the plague doctor re-emerged on social media, a surreal mascot for COVID-19 memes, dancing in alleys, spraying Lysol from a copper beak, wearing gloves and cracking jokes about hand sanitizer. He became absurd, ironic, internet famous. But that's the trick, isn't it? We laugh because we're scared. We bring the doctor back because deep down, part of us knows we might need him again. And it's not just pop culture. During the early months of modern pandemics, doctors and nurses reported seeing people draw parallels not to advanced medicine or modern hospitals, but to the plague years. People posted comparisons between ICU gowns and plague robes, shared photos of nurses with bruised faces from masks and face shields, echoing the burden of their masked predecessors. Even in our world of MRIs and antibiotics, we still reach for the old symbols. Why? Because the plague doctor is archetype. He's not just a costume. He's a signal that something is wrong, that something ancient has returned, that despite our progress, we're still vulnerable. He reminds us that when systems fail, when the air is dangerous and no one has answers, we still look to the mask, not for magic, but for meaning, for the idea that someone, somewhere, will walk into the smoke when the rest of us flee. And if we have to imagine that person with a beak, so be it. Because the plague doctor was never just about medicine. He was about standing between the living and the dead and saying, "I will face it first." There's one more layer we rarely talk about: the psychology of wearing the beak. Because while the world saw a healer, a reaper, a ghost in robes, the man inside the mask experienced something else entirely. Something strange. Something transformative. You see, the mask didn't just hide the doctor's face. It hid his fear, his identity, even his humanity. And over time, that does something to a person. Doctors reported strange sensations after extended periods in costume, a feeling of disembodiment, like they weren't themselves anymore. One wrote, "After 3 weeks in the mask, I no longer felt like a man. I was the mask. It breathed for me. It watched for me. When I removed it, the world was too bright, too close, too loud." They called it the beak effect. Some modern psychologists believe it was an early example of protective dissociation, the mind shielding itself by stepping into a role so fully it becomes real. The robe, the mask, the cane, they weren't just tools. They were armor. You weren't Thomas, a 32-year-old from Lyon with a wife and 2 sons. You were Dr. Pestis, the plague's last defense. And that persona, that mask, gave you permission. permission to walk into rooms filled with death, permission to cut open a bubo without flinching, permission to survive. But it came at a cost. Many doctors, after the plague ended, struggled to return to normal life. They couldn't sleep without the scent of vinegar. They twitched at coughs. Some kept their masks hanging in closets like relics. One buried his in the garden, then dug it up again 2 weeks later. There are cases of former plague doctors refusing to remove their robes for months, not because of infection, but because they felt naked without them. They wrote of nightmares, of being maskless during outbreaks, of watching loved ones sicken while they stood helpless, unarmored. The mask had become more than fabric and leather. It was identity, safety, a second skin. And when that skin was gone, so was the person who had worn it. Today, trauma specialists would call it occupational PTSD. Back then, it was just madness. Some were institutionalized. Some vanished. A few were found wandering forests in their old robes, muttering to trees, asking where the patients had gone. We often look at the plague doctor as a symbol of fear. But maybe for the man inside the beak, he was a symbol of survival. Because once you've worn death's costume, can you ever fully take it off? Now imagine this. You're standing in the middle of a silent city. The bells have stopped. The carts no longer roll. The fires are out. You are the last one. Your mask heavy. Your robe stiff. Your gloves sticky from weeks of wear. You press your cane against a door. No answer. Another. No answer. The whole neighborhood is dead. And for the first time, you ask a question you've never dared to voice. What happens to a doctor when there are no more patients? Because your job wasn't just healing. It was witnessing. It was presence. And now, it's silence. Some plague doctors wrote of this exact moment. They called it the long hush. The eerie stillness after the storm when death had fed well, and the survivors were too afraid to speak. One wrote, "The quiet is worse than the screams. When they cried, I could work. Now I only hear my own breath, my own mask." The long hush was a turning point, not just for them, but for history. Because that's when people began to remember the plague doctor not as a man, but as a myth. Stories spread. In Paris, they whispered of a masked figure who walked the rooftops at night, looking for the next outbreak. In Milan, children claimed they saw a beak in the mist even when the plague had long passed. By the 1800s, he was already half legend. No longer a man who treated the sick, but a spirit that arrived when something was wrong. A harbinger, a warning, a silent figure who didn't knock, didn't speak, just stood and watched. Artists painted him in graveyards. Poets wrote verses about his hollow gaze. And storytellers turned him into something like the Grim Reaper's apprentice. A little more human, a little more haunted. Because unlike death, who finishes things, the plague doctor starts them. His presence means the sickness is just beginning. Even today, if you look closely at plague-themed horror films, comics, and folklore, you'll see him in the background. Standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. Not evil, not good, just inevitable. That's the strange inheritance of the mask. It began as protection. It became symbol. And now, it's story. Which begs the question, if he appears again in another time, another form, will we recognize him? Will we know that the long hush is ending? And will someone, anyone, be ready to wear the beak again? The mask, the robes, the cane, the myths. But for all we've said, there's one piece of the plague doctor's story we haven't touched yet. The patients. Because while it's easy to focus on the doctor, the figure in black, The silent walker, we often forget the faces on the other side of that beak. The people who opened the door, or didn't. The mothers holding feverish children. The old men too weak to stand. The servants who knew, just by the way the knock sounded, that death had come in human form. Imagine being one of them. Imagine seeing him step into your home. No smile, no greeting, just glass eyes staring out from behind a bird's face. You're sick, burning, bleeding, gasping. And this is who shows up? Not your priest, not your family, not even a man with a warm touch or a kind word. Just this thing. He opens his bag, pulls out a leech, a knife, maybe a little bundle of dried herbs. You don't know if it'll help. You don't even know if he's a real doctor. But what choice do you have? The actual writings of plague victims, where they survive, tell us so much. One Italian woman wrote, "He never removed the mask, not even when I wept. He pressed a cloth to my skin and left. That was my treatment." Another account from Prague describes a doctor entering a house with 4 children. He took one look and told the mother, "Only the middle boy will survive. Prepare the rest." He was right. And how does that kind of moment stay with someone? What does it do to a town when the doctor is more feared than the disease? When the knock on the door means your last chapter is beginning? Even the healthy weren't safe from the mask. Plague doctors were often empowered to quarantine entire households, confiscate property, even order burials without consent. Some were told to carry colored markers, painting doors with red crosses or attaching symbols to indicate contamination. So if your house was visited even once you became an outcast, a target, a warning, people avoided your street, burned your belongings, shunned your children. And as the days wore on, the sight of the doctor didn't inspire hope. It inspired dread. Not because he brought death, but because his presence meant death was already here. This is perhaps the cruelest irony. The man sent to heal became the messenger of the end, not because of who he was, but because of when he arrived. And in that sense, the true legacy of the plague doctor might not be found in masks or museums, but in the memory of the knock on the door and the silence that came after. So let's ask the unspoken question. Did the plague doctor ever truly help anyone? It's easy to say no. He didn't understand germs. He used leeches and bad air theories. He arrived too late. He fled too early. But what if we're asking the wrong question? What if the value of the plague doctor wasn't measured in lives saved, but in what he symbolized? Let's strip everything away for a moment. The beak, the robe, the mask, the theories. Forget the failures, the fears, the rituals. What are you left with? A man, or sometimes a boy, barely older than 20, walking into houses everyone else ran from. A figure willing to enter the most dangerous place in the world, a plague-ridden home. Was he always skilled? Number? Was he always brave? Not really. But he was there. And sometimes, in history, presence is everything. He wrote down names. He comforted the dying. He told a mother when her child still had a chance. He whispered prayers over swollen bodies and helped bury the dead when no one else would touch them. In cities where families died alone, he was the last face they saw, even if it was behind a beak. In towns where fear ruled the streets, he was a strange kind of defiance. He stood still while others scattered. And maybe that matters more than we think. Because for centuries, human beings have needed figures like this. Not miracle workers, not flawless saviors, but witnesses, people who show up, who endure the unbearable not because they want to, but because someone has to. We see this in firefighters who enter burning buildings, in nurses during pandemics, in aid workers in war zones, in volunteers during floods and earthquakes. They don't always fix things. They don't always succeed. But they arrive. And they stay. That's the part of the plague doctor we don't talk about. The part that still haunts the mask. Not because of death, but because of what it cost to be there. Maybe the beak wasn't a symbol of medicine. Maybe it was a symbol of sacrifice, of choosing to stand at the edge of collapse and say, I will walk into the smoke, even if I don't come back. And now we reach the veil, that thin curtain where history becomes legend and legend becomes something else. The ghost of the plague doctor. Because, yes, he's a historical figure. Yes, he wore a beaked mask. Yes, he treated the sick. But that's not the version people whisper about when the lights are off. They speak of something else. A figure who still walks empty hallways, who knocks on doors that were never opened, who appears in dreams when you've been coughing for too long. The folklore began soon after the worst outbreaks ended. Towns where the plague had taken nearly everyone told stories of a man in black still roaming the streets at dusk, tapping with a cane that echoed even on dirt roads. They said he didn't speak, didn't breathe, just stood and watched. Some said if you saw him in your dreams, someone in your home would be gone by morning. In Sicily, mothers warned their children not to play in alleys after dark, lest the Uomo del Becco appear. In the Netherlands, an old tale tells of a doctor who wandered a quarantined village alone, lighting candles in every window. When the candles burned out, he vanished. The next morning, the entire village was gone. Even today, travelers claim to see him on misty bridges, in hospital stairwells, in old cities just before sunrise. No words, no movement, just the mask, watching. And that begs the question, why does he linger? Maybe it's guilt. Maybe the plague doctor became death's apprentice not by choice but by default. And now he walks still, unable to unlearn what he saw. Or maybe, and this is harder to admit, we're the ones who won't let him go. Because deep down we know he's useful. A symbol, a scapegoat, a warning. When the next illness comes, when the air feels wrong, when the cough won't stop, we reach for the old shape again. We draw the beak. We post the memes. We tell the stories. Because some part of us believes that as long as the plague doctor still walks the edge of memory, then maybe someone is still watching, still keeping track, still standing between us and the dark. Not to stop it, not to cure it, but to remind us we've been here before. And we are not alone. So here we are, the end of the mask, the end of the myth. Or maybe just the beginning. Because even now, hundreds of years later, the plague doctor hasn't left us. He's evolved, he's adapted, he's lingered in the folds of history like a stubborn shadow that refuses to be forgotten. And maybe that's exactly what we need. Because the plague doctor is more than a man in robes, more than a mistake in medicine, more than a silhouette in a smoky room. He's a mirror, a reflection of everything we fear and everything we hope for. We fear disease. We fear dying alone. We fear silence. But we hope desperately for someone to stand with us in the worst of it. Someone who doesn't run. Someone who shows up, even if he wears a beak, even if he can't help, even if all he can do is write down the names of the lost and say, softly, I was here, I saw. That might be enough. Because the plague doctor reminds us that history isn't just grand kings and epic wars. It's a man sweating behind a leather mask. It's a woman mixing herbs in the dark. It's a child staring at the beak and asking if their father is going to be okay. It's small, human moments, and unbearable ones. We want so badly to believe we're past all that. that with science and hospitals and Wi-Fi, we've beaten the worst. But deep down, we know outbreaks return, panic returns, the unknown always knocks. And when it does, the mask reappears. Not because it works, not because it heals, but because it represents a line between order and collapse, between someone who tries and everyone else who hides. So tonight, as you lay in your clean sheets, behind locked doors, in a world where medicine usually works and masks sometimes mean safety, remember this. There was a time not so long ago when survival wore a bird's face, and he is not forgotten, not because he saved the world, but because he faced it